There was a lot of really good news in yesterday's video about the director's cut, aka Luke Smith's State of the Game post. So far, I've spent my time summarizing all that good news in that neat little video over there that you can watch, and haven't really shared my thoughts on too much of it. So today, I'm going to do that. Instead of trying to share my thoughts on each specific change and minor addition, I'm going to really focus on the things that I have a lot to say about. If you'd like to know my thoughts on a specific topic, feel free to ask me in the channel's Discord server. If you watched Dado's thoughts video on this, which chances are you have, then I'll spare you from having to listen to the exact same sentiments he shared repeated, since I tend to find my own views pretty in line with his, and I don't want to bore you. What I've done is split my thoughts up into two categories. First one is things I really like, and the second is things I didn't like, or important stuff that I felt like should have been brought up, but wasn't. We'll start first with the stuff I really liked. PvP. I don't think there was a single change surrounding PvP that I didn't like or agree with. More playlist with a variety of modes? Check. A solo competitive playlist where you can earn glory? Check. Heavy ammo not being just restricted to one person anymore? Check. Crucible labs actually being used for things like 3v3 elimination with awesome maps from D1? Again, check. Supers being easier to challenge in Shadowkeep? You get the point, right? In part 3, Luke Smith said that they want the game to have more of a focus on the Fireteam of 3 trend that most of the game outside of PvP already uses. They took a gamble in Destiny 2, converting the entire PvP experience to 4v4. Turns out, everyone disliked that. And ever since, we've been working our way back slowly to the everything is a factor of 3 formula that players feel at home with. Speaking of 3v3, what about Trials? Where is my Pinnacle PvP mode? Well, there's two parts to this one, and depending on how much you read into this, Trials, more specifically Trials of Osiris, could very well be making a return. Luke says the following in regards to Trials of the Nine in Destiny 2. Quote, "The theme felt weaker, the Trials card was less important, and the stakes felt lower. Trials of the Nine didn't work the way we'd hoped, and Trials of the Nine is on hiatus indefinitely." Why is this important? Well, the word 9 is italicized, possibly alluding to the return of Trials, just not Trials of the Nine specifically. This gets even more suspicious when later in the post, Luke's discussing 3v3 elimination and how they're testing different variations of the mode in Crucible Labs. He says elimination, for the time being, is a great fit for Crucible Labs. We fully expect it to graduate out of Labs and find a warmer home. Now, as many of you know, Trials of Osiris was originally 3v3 elimination, and if you were lucky enough or skilled enough to complete your Trials card with 9 wins and no losses, you gained access to the Lighthouse on Mercury, where a bunch of awesome loot awaited you. Is this a coincidence that Luke used the term warmer home? Maybe, but could it also be alluding to the Osiris Lighthouse theme returning once elimination is fully fleshed out? I think it's entirely likely. All speculation at the moment though, so don't get too hyped just yet. Buff stacking, this is a big one. This pretty much completely changes the entire game because going forward, you're only going to gain benefits from the strongest buff that is currently active. There are exceptions, like you'll still be able to get the healing effects from Well, even if another buff overpowers that of Well's damage buff. But for the most part, things have been simplified. And what does this mean for your gameplay? On one hand, there's probably going to be less coordination required between groups to execute optimal DPS, or more depending on how you look at it. And on the other hand, this change allows for individual buffs and debuffs to shine more. Instead of just stacking every possible buff you can at all times, it sounds like you're going to want to make a more strategic choice on what to bring into activities. In Shadowkeep, it sounds like the Night Stalker Hunter or the Sentinel Titan with Word of Dawn is going to be as important as having a full team stacked with 20 different buffs is right now. The individual player is going to have more of a responsibility depending on their role, which reduces the need for every player to run the most optimal loadout because only the strongest buff is going to matter. Now sure, people are still going to run a ton of buffs and debuffs because every player can use their own individually, and in some content like raids, you're likely going to want to have a variety of different options to increase your damage. But I'm hoping this means the endgame content will actually prove to be challenging for longer than a few days. Instead of players just throwing every possible buff and debuff at the boss, they're probably going to have to stop and pace themselves and plan a little bit better. At least that's what I'm hoping. There's a lot more to creating difficult content though, and I'm hopeful that other mechanics, things that also remove the challenge of the game, are tuned this fall. When it comes to the evolving narrative of Destiny 2, things have been all over the place. The story seems to wander in a ton of different directions without any grand purpose. And speaking specifically on Forsaken and the Annual Pass, there's been very little that feels like closure. We're still waiting on the Dreaming City storyline to end after almost a year. Black Armory felt somewhat conclusive with Civics finally defeated, but again that was just kind of a random storyline that had no connection to the Dreaming City curse. The whole Drifter emissary thing was left open-ended, which somehow led us back to Callus and his never-ending fascination with us, yet none of those story beats actually mend together with each other. Needless to say, it feels like we're just chillin', hopping from planet to planet, taking care of people's problems, without any overarching thread keeping us moving forward towards any sort of end goal. Thankfully, this is a problem that Bungie has noticed themselves. In Part 3, Luke Smith says that the upcoming seasons will work more like a relay race, where when one season is wrapping up, it passes the narrative baton to the next season, resolving and then starting a new chain of events, with the goal of it feeling like one big connected story arc. And this is extremely important because the story aspect of Destiny and Destiny 2 outside of the Grimoire and the lore books has been almost meaningless. Taken King is still, in my opinion, the best example of a well-written Destiny story that didn't just end up being a random forgettable event or a story arc that just kind of faded out without any real consequences or changes in the world. Oryx, the Taken King, is still the best villain Destiny's ever had because his reactions were a result of our actions. We killed his son, so he came to our system for revenge. And that revenge was not short-lived, despite what the length of the actual campaign was. We followed him into his throne world and killed him again. But even after all that was said and done, his impact on the world meant things were never going to be the same. His Taken still roam the system 4 years later. They're on multiple different planets including Mars, Earth, Io, and most recently the Dreaming City. Oryx's impact can still be felt today in new content, which is a pretty big deal and something that hasn't happened since. The closest we've gotten to that is when Riven was killed, the curse was unleashed on the Dreaming City. And that was freaking awesome. I mean, it changed the entire destination, and being able to visit Mara Sov actually made it feel like the story was moving forward. Sadly, the whole thing came to a complete stop for some reason, and the curse was never resolved. We never found out what happened to Aldrin, we never got contacted by Mara Sov again, and while the NPCs on the destination had new dialogue and made it feel like the curse was still moving on, the story just grinded to a halt. If this new Vex storyline extends across multiple seasons, and whatever happens in the Black Garden affects the world and actually changes things, like the director's cut says will happen, then we're definitely in for an exciting new adventure. And the last thing that I really liked, that's going to lead us perfectly into the stuff I dislike, is Luke's mentality on power. He says the team recognizes how meaningless your power number has become. In the early days of Destiny 1, if you saw someone at max power, you knew what it took to get there. You knew that that max level player poured some blood, sweat, and space magic into that level grind, and that number was worn like a badge of honor. Back then, power was really one of the only things to chase, and naturally it became a meaningful investment. But thanks to triumphs, titles, collections, seasonal progression stuff coming in the form of artifacts, and just an overall easier power climb, power is borderline meaningless. With all the new and old players being boosted up to 750 this fall, the only thing your power level is indicative of is whether or not you bought Shadowkeep. To Luke and Bungie's credit, they've not only recognized this issue, which is great because knowing is half the battle, but they've also said that they, quote, feel like the power system may benefit from a rework further down the road. And that gets me interested. I would love to see power be reworked and garner back some of that feeling of prestige it had in the original game. They've sort of touched on this problem in Shadowkeep, stating that the only way to earn drops above 950 power will be through new Pinnacle powerful sources. And I believe this is what the game needs more of. Currently, you can do anything in the game and reach max light. Like, literally anything. Flashpoints comprised of public events, daily story missions, bounties, everything from the most menial task to the hardest challenge rewards the same exact power, and so there's really no incentive to play difficult content because why would I when I can get the same stuff from easier activities? And this brings us to the things I didn't like. I'll really only be focusing on one main topic for the second half of this video. I didn't want to have an entire segment on my concerns about Eververse. Everything I was going to say you guys have already brought up. More unique cosmetics need to come from activities, Eververse prices are too high, etc. It's been talked about to death, and I agree with most of you on this stuff, but since many other creators have probably filled their quota on the topic, let's talk about something that I haven't really seen anyone discuss. So there's this problem that's kind of existed since the release of Destiny 2, and that's prestige loot. Way back in the first State of Destiny 2 from November 2017, Bungie addressed the lack of Pinnacle rewards in the game with a small but important mention that they were working on, quote, better incentives for players who complete challenging prestige activities. Now this was back when some activities actually had a prestige difficulty tier, prestige nightfalls and prestige raids. I definitely think different difficulty tiers should come back. That's a topic for a different time now. But the word prestige is still relevant because it's interchangeable with something like the word pinnacle. We may no longer have the prestige difficulty, but I would still consider raids to be the prestige endgame content, aka Pinnacle Endgame content. And so, Bungie said they were looking to provide better incentives for those challenging activities, which in a sense I guess you could argue titles and such do fill that void a little bit, but in my opinion we're still a long way away from the pinnacle loot of Destiny 1. Pinnacle endgame activities should be one of the only ways to get to max power, which it seems like they've addressed. But there should also be Pinnacle endgame rewards alongside those activities that are equally meaningful. And while I'm mainly going to be discussing PvE loot, the same Pinnacle reward system should obviously be applied to PvP. If Trials does return, that would be the perfect place for it. When we take a look back at Destiny 1 and look specifically at raid loot, we can see there's a variety of weapons that feel good but don't necessarily look amazing, and weapons that look amazing but aren't necessarily the most coveted things in the game. And of course you have plenty of weapons that satisfy both categories. That's kind of the two parts of loot in my opinion, the looks and the function, the vanity aspect and the gameplay aspect. Now all of this is subjective of course, not every weapon looks or feels cool to everyone the same, but there's one core idea that's persisted throughout all the Destiny 1 raids that for the most part is completely absent from the raids in the sequel. And that core idea was that raid loot from the Pinnacle endgame activities should have its own identity. That it should be better or at least offer something unique when compared to the loot that the average player could obtain from various other low stakes activities. This idea resulted in most raid loot being pretty coveted across those 4 different experiences offered in the first game, but in Destiny 2, raid weapons and armor are a shell of their former self. And well, that really sucks. So in order to show how much better raid loot could be, let's look at what made Destiny 1's raid loot so special. Remember earlier when I said there's 2 main parts to making good loot, the look of it and the functionality of it? Yeah, well, Bungie didn't always nail that first part. Looking back at the weapons from Vault of Glass, all of them look extremely boring. They're bland, generic weapons with a brown coat of paint. There's nothing interesting about their appearance, and there's nothing about them that tells a story or makes them stand out among other loot, besides the flavor text, of course. This was also my issue with the weapons from Crown of Sorrow, and to a lesser extent, Wrath of the Machine. I know I might get some hate for this one, but come on, they could have gotten a little bit crazier with the designs. At least Wrath weapons had some wires and tiny triangles on them and a Siva logo slapped on the side, but with things like Crown of Sorrow's weapons, I gotta wonder, how does rust have anything to do with this raid? With Galron, with the Crown of Sorrow, or with the Leviathan? You can't even put a shader on it because it's covered in a random rust texture. From a visual design perspective, these weapons don't really have anything that screams raid loot from the depths of an alien lair. To Vault of Glass's credit, the armor was on point. All of the armor from the original Destiny raids were fantastic, and they only got better with age of Triumph in Year 3. But even if raid loot wasn't always as eccentric as I would have preferred, Destiny 1's raid loot had some things that made it stand out gameplay-wise. Even if the appearance isn't up to par, it's clear that a weapon or armor piece can still be incredible if given something that gives it personality. Destiny 1 weapons and armor had intrinsic and exclusive perks that were created specifically for that raid, and some of the weapons early on were elemental primaries, which were a pretty big deal. This was something that only happened on endgame loot. It had something that made them unique. Raid armor used to have perks that were designed to give you benefits in the raid. Things like Anti-Praetorian, which gave you additional super energy when you destroyed a Praetorian in the Vault of Glass. Or the perk Vex Breaker, which says killing a Vex with a melee attack has a chance to spawn an orb. The armor looked cool, and it was useful. Look at Crota's End as an example. Black Hammer was introduced, with its perk White Nail that refilled your magazine from reserves if you landed 3 precision hits in a row. And you could only get that on Black Hammer from the raid. Abyss Defiant, another Crota's End weapon. It was a solar primary that had perks like projectiles have a chance to stun Hive Wizards, and this weapon does extra damage to Hive Magers. So again, the weapons were unique, strong, and useful in their activities. Now let's take a look at the design of the King's Fall weapons. Holy Traveler. Now these are what I call raid weapons. Clearly a lot of love went into making these feel alien and dangerous. They look like they were just pulled straight out of a science fiction movie, or like you just stomped a bunch of Hive bosses and then picked up the weapons they were using. And these weapons, while maybe not as coveted for some, also had their fair share of intrinsic perks like Cocoon, which reloaded the weapon automatically when it was stowed, and unique abilities like dealing extra damage to the Taken with the Will of Light perk. Sadly, King's Fall weapons didn't have anything like elemental primaries, as that was retired for year 2. Then we get to Wrath of the Machine, where the quality of weapon design, in my opinion, is a downgrade from King's Fall, but from a gameplay perspective, it was a huge upgrade, with some of the most interesting loot I've seen in any raid. For example, Genesis Chain, the auto rifle, had a perk called Focused Fire, that says when zoomed in, this weapon fires slower, but causes additional damage. Alongside Focused Fire, this weapon also had an additional perk called Focused Firefly. Focused Firefly says that when Focused Fire is active, precision kills cause the target to explode. 2 perks that work together to make unique synergism that changes the gameplay up and is both useful in and outside of the raid. Or how about the shotgun Quantaplasm, which had the perk Battle Runner that gave you a boost to your sprint's top speed after a kill. But it also had the perk Running Interference, which says that when Battle Runner is active, you get increased armor. The synergy that these raid weapons had really took them to an entirely new level. Now that was Destiny 1. So now let's transition over to Destiny 2 and take a look at a handful of weapons across the different raids. Judging them strictly by their appearance, most of them follow a similar design philosophy when it comes to what the aesthetic of a raid weapon should be. It's pretty believable that, for example, the Last Wish weapons actually came from the Dreaming City. Even the original Leviathan weapons fit the theme of that raid really well. So it's clear Bungie can design good-looking raid weapons and armor too. While maybe not as beloved as the original raid sets, I'd say Last Wish, Leviathan, and Crown of Sorrow sets are all really neat. I've talked previously about how Bungie could do better with designing sets that are more themed around the specific enemies and bosses though, like Spire of Stars should have been a Cabal set where you get Gladiator armor, or one of the sets has a Phalanx shield on your back, or someone gets Scion armor, and like in Scourge of the Past, there should have been Berserker armor, Stealth Vandal armor, and maybe Fallen Captain armor. It does seem like Bungie is honing in on that themed armor with Garden of Salvation. If the Vex armor in the background of this Vidoc is in fact the raid armor, then a lot of people are going to be very happy. So for the most part, they've got the visuals down in D2, but something they've yet to do with raid loot is make them function differently than a normal weapon and actually be on par with what I'd expect from Pinnacle Endgame loot. The visuals are one thing, you can have stuff that looks good, but if it doesn't offer anything that really enhances your gameplay, why would you bother grinding for it, right? And this is one of my biggest complaints with the game currently. It's not just a problem with raid loot alone, as I talked about in my previous videos, but raid loot just isn't what it should be. And sure, not every piece of raid loot from Destiny 1 was the best thing ever, or the strongest thing ever, but I'd say more often than not, you really wanted that endgame raid loot. Now it just feels like I grind for it to fill out my collections, and that's not a new problem. As I said, that's existed in Destiny 2 since launch and was covered in the 2017 State of the Game update only a few months after launch. I'm still kinda surprised that going into the third year, raid loot is still this lackluster. Personally, I feel like the Escalation Protocol weapons and things like the 1-2 punch shotgun you can get from Gambit Prime and Reckoning would all make much better exclusive raid weapons than most of the actual raid weapons in the game. And part of this problem is we're currently living in the age of pinnacle weapons. The Crucible pinnacle weapons are so strong, they dominate in every single area of the game. Pinnacle weapons have been getting so much more love than raid weapons since their inception, because not only are they stronger than a lot of endgame weapons and even exotics, but also because they offer something you can't get with other weapons. And this is exactly what raid loot needs to do. It needs to offer something exclusive. There needs to be exclusive perks, there needs to be strengths that only raid loot has, and features that only raid loot should get access to. And what do I mean by this? Well, I'm going to give a few examples of things that aren't new ideas, by the way. In fact, they're ideas I stole from Bungie. I'm not usually one to say, just make it like it was in the first game, because I always believe there's room for improvement, and it's usually better to try something new than just repeat the same stuff. But this is one of those cases where if it's not broken, and it works, don't fix it. Raid loot in Destiny 2 needs a few things. It needs intrinsic perks that roll on raid weapons that are designed for that specific raid or enemy type. Let's say the new pulse rifle from Garden of Salvations has a perk that does extra damage to Minotaur shields. Or maybe it can apply a weakening effect to Vex enemies. Or maybe it does extra damage to bosses in Garden of Salvation. This makes those raid weapons more useful in their own activity and gives you a reason to use them over whatever the meta might be. Raid loot also needs exclusive perks, things you cannot get to roll on other weapons from other activities. For example, what if you could only get the perk Battle Runner on a shotgun from Garden of Salvation? Or what if the Touch of Mercy perk returns, but can only roll on a Garden of Salvation light machine gun? The key here is the exclusive perks need to be strong and desirable without being so overly strong that they completely overshadow all other weapons. And finally, the new raid should have curated roles that are handcrafted to have synergy like the weapons from Wrath of the Machine. In Destiny 1, raid roles were static, which some of you liked and some of you didn't. And I'm not sure I see us going back to that, so as an alternative option, I think curated roles from raid should always be what the static role would have been if we were still using the old system. Make the curated roles badass. Give us some really strong synergy with perks that enhance your weapon or abilities. All of the things I listed will make raid loot desirable. And I understand it can be a tough line to walk, making them feel strong and fun to use without making them overpowered or so strong that people feel like they need to raid in order to get the best loot. I do believe pinnacle weapons should still be allowed to shine as a very strong alternative option for those who don't enjoy raiding or prefer other activities more, but raid weapons need to be unique and they should offer something that no other weapon can, which will allow them to rival pinnacle weapons in certain situations. In Destiny 2, we do have a few outliers. Things like the Nation of Beasts, which can have Outlaw and Dragonfly, Bane of Sorrow, which can have Dragonfly, and No Feelings that can have Box Breathing. A few weapons here and there can roll with one or two perks, or a combination of perks that you can't get anywhere else, but they are few and far between. And sadly, they aren't really game changers when compared to the loot you can get from easier activities. Most raid weapons are honestly not even worth doing the raid for, and most raid weapons in the game aren't going to come close to the things that I'm already using in my loadout. And this was the one thing that I was really hoping to hear about that wasn't touched on at all in the director's cut, which was kind of surprising. No mention of making raid loot better, adding more PvP endgame loot, or making any sort of pinnacle raid weapon quest like Legend of Acreus or Outbreak Prime. Overall, Luke and the team at Bungie have pretty much covered every single thing I was hoping they would, except for that. And factions, like where are my factions? If they can give us more cool stuff to chase at the very top for both PvE and PvP, then I've got no more complaints really. So those are my thoughts on the info in the director's cut. Please feel free to ask me about specific stuff in the Discord channel. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and I hope you all have a fantastic day.